Hello beautiful people and welcome! Hi! To a video on the upcoming 5.5 characters Iansan and Varesa, going over my first impressions of their kit. We've got some really interesting mechanics going here. So, very short introduction. Iansan is an attack buffer where her attack buff is dependent on you moving. Right, she's an Nightsoul character, so she's got a Nightsoul mechanic, and the way that her Nightsoul mechanic effectively works in her kit is she gets an attack buff that's more or less proportional to how much Nightsoul she has. She consumes Nightsoul over time, like most of the Nightsoul characters, and you can gain Nightsoul back by moving. The more you move, the more Nightsoul you gain back. The size of the attack buff that she provides is honestly fairly big. It's not quite as big as Bennett, but it's honestly not that far behind. And so a lot of people have been very excited for her and her potential to replace Bennett in a bunch of teams. So we'll talk about that. And the other character, Varesa, she's a plunge-focused electro character where your main gameplay loop relies on using skills so that you can launch yourself in the air and following it up with plunge attacks, and following up those plunge attacks sometimes with her burst, which is a special burst, right? Instead of just having one burst, she has two. If she uses her burst after some of the specific plunge attacks, it does a smaller version of the burst that's considered plunge damage, that has a shorter animation, that has a lower amount of motion value, and that costs a lot less energy. Let's start by talking about Varesa, I think, before Iansan. So she's a catalyst character, which is always nice. When it comes to catalysts, you can always use their normal attack as a part of your setups. Mainly for electro characters, you can use it either to facilitate electro swirls or to get an overload on Chevreuse without needing to swap to an electro character or use abilities with cooldowns. Chevreuse's attack buff is reliant on you triggering overload before you use her skill, and because of that, depending on the other characters you have on your team, you might end up effectively either having to use an ability before you get the buffs, like is often the case in official teams with Chevreuse, or using the abilities before if they're not abilities that get buffed, but they're buffs with a shorter duration than Chevreuse. So for example, in the Arlecchino Bennett teams with Chevreuse, on the first rotation, you end up using Bennett before Chevreuse because you want to snapshot Bennett's attack buff onto official, and so you want to go to official after Bennett. But if you go to official after Bennett, that forces Chevreuse to be after official because you won't get an overload without official. Point being, a character being a catalyst that has a way to just apply electro just by doing a normal attack is often going to facilitate your setups in a bunch of different teams. It's not a major thing, but it is kind of helpful. Outside of that, so like I said, her main gameplay loop relies on using your skill and following it up with a charge attack. The way that it works is when you use her charge attack, it makes you jump after the charge attack, and that jump is high enough to plunge. Obviously, she's a catalyst character, and like a lot of the catalyst characters, her charge attack costs 50 stamina, which is a lot, and so kind of sucks to have to spam this. But if you use a charge attack after your skill, it won't cost stamina. So you use your skill, follow it up with a charge attack, that makes you jump, follow that up with a plunge attack. Her Nightsoul mechanic effectively generates Nightsoul when she uses her skill and when she uses a plunge attack. Her maximum Nightsoul is 40, and she generates either 20 or 25 Nightsoul based on what she used, 20 from using her skill and 25 from using a plunge, which means she will fill up her Nightsoul in one E charge attack plunge base combo. When her Nightsoul bar is filled, she enters the Fiery Passion state, which they say reset her skill cooldown, but it's not actually a reset. It's like a secondary skill that you can use that doesn't share cooldown with the initial one. So a good way to like think about it is you can think about it like the second part of Cutman's E. Once you fill up your Nightsoul, it effectively makes it so that you can use a special ability like the second part of Cutman's E that doesn't have a cooldown of itself that you can only use under specific scenarios. It doesn't actually reset the cooldown. It's kind of just an extra E that you can do that doesn't look at the cooldown. When you use that, it effectively does the exact same thing, but in the Fiery Passion state, it does a bit more damage. So both the damage of the skill itself, but also the damage of the Fiery Passion charge attack, which is 4% higher than the base one, which doesn't matter that much. But more importantly, the damage of the plunge attack, which goes from 368% to 552 at talent level 10. That being said, the biggest upside of the Fiery Passion state isn't just the fact that it has higher motion value, is that you get one more E, which lets you get one more plunge. At a baseline, her skill has a 9-second cooldown with 2 charges, which means you'd be able to do 2 E's followed by plunges. But with the Fiery Passion state, that means that each E followed by a plunge adds the special E followed by a special plunge. So instead of 2, you get 4. She has a burst that fills up her Nightsoul. The default burst costs 70. It fills up her Nightsoul bar. It's really bad. Filling up the Nightsoul isn't that bad, but it does burst damage, and as we're gonna see later, she gets a decent amount of plunge damage percent from her own kit and from her artifact set. Whereas the secondary burst that she can do after doing a plunge in Fiery Passion. So again, as a quick reminder, she starts out with a normal skill, followed by a normal charge attack, followed by a normal plunge. That makes her enter Fiery Passion, and then she can do the same thing, but instead of normal ones, they're ones in her special state. Once she's done that plunge in her special state, for like about a second after doing that plunge, she can use a special burst, which costs 30 energy instead of 70, and which has a slightly lower motion value. This is what you want to do. The default burst has a pretty long animation and isn't plunge damage. The special burst, the low cost one, is very quick, costs a lot less energy, is plunge damage. In most situations, this is what you're doing. You're pretty much ignoring the default burst. Design-wise, I think that's a bit disappointing because I wish there were some situations where you actually wanted to use the default burst. I guess to some extent there might be. If your skill is on cooldown, you could use the burst to get your special plunge, but generally you won't really use it. But yeah, that special burst doesn't have a cooldown, but in order to use it, you need to have done a enhanced plunge from the Fiery Passion state, which requires you to have done a normal plunge already in order to enter that state. Which means, in practice, you'll only be able to use it twice, maybe 3 times per rotation. This is a really cool kit design, in my opinion. I really like the idea of having a special burst that doesn't have a cooldown and costs less energy. I really think the biggest downside design-wise to this kit design is just that there's not much of a reason to use a default burst. I really hope that in future beta versions, they either massively buff this or maybe give you a different buff when you use it to incentivize a playstyle that can at least sometimes justify using the default burst, because otherwise I feel like that's a bit sad. But yeah, I'm not gonna go into all the details. I'll keep that for the pre-release, but this is a very interesting kit. Right now, as of the first version of the beta, pretty decent numbers. They're not outstanding, but they're still pretty solid. The best unit to compare her to would be Chlorine, because Chlorine is a unit who is also an electro carry, and I think you're gonna end up playing both of them in relatively similar teams. It's looking to me so far like she's gonna be a little bit better than Chlorine in her best teams, but her team versatility is gonna be worse than Chlorine's team versatility. Her non-optimal teams, I think so far, look to be worse than Chlorine's non-optimal teams. There's a few things that contribute to making her potentially better than Chlorine in her best teams. The main ones are, one, she's a Natlan character, which means that in Chevreuse teams where you want an off-field pyro in order to keep the Chevreuse buff for your electro carry, having a Natlan carry instead of a non-Natlan carry means that Mawika generates a lot more fighting spirit, which makes Mawika much stronger, and that synergy helps a lot. Honestly, that's really the main thing. Because she's a plunge character, a lot of people will look at her synergy with Xianyan. Xianyan is not a bad character for her. Xianyan will be an option for her good teams, but I think compared to other plungers, the Xianyan synergy is lower. Her default motion value is relatively high, and there's a decent amount of her rotations that will not get 8 plunges, which means you don't get all the value from the plunge buff on Xianyan. Honestly, I think it's fair to say that one of the biggest advantages that Xianyan provides in her teams is that Xianyan front loads fanfare generation with Farina, whereas other healing support options often either only heal in single target or heal relatively slowly. Xianyan helps you get a lot more fanfare on average, which is honestly the biggest difference compared to characters like Xilonen, for example. She has a passive that effectively says this character is a lot better with Xilonen. When a nearby party member triggers a Nightsoul burst, Varesa's attack is increased by 30%, max 2 stacks. Because it's a max of 2 stacks, it means if you trigger Nightsoul burst twice in quick succession, you get more attack, and the only character that can do that is Xilonen. By default, Nightsoul burst has a cooldown, the one that just happens when you deal elemental damage, of 18 seconds with one Natlan character, 12 with 2, and 9 with 3. Her teams will generally have either 2 or 3, but even if it's 3 with 9 seconds, seconds cooldown, there's going to be very little overlap between the first and second stacks. There's only going to be 3 seconds of overlap, so it's generally about 30%. But with Shilonen, because her skill triggers Nightsoul Burst as part of her kit, that means that you effectively will always have the 60% attack, which is nice. That being said, honestly, Varesa is not the highlight of the patch. I started with her because I wanted to keep the best for last. Iansan is a character that is not only really cool kit-wise, but also looking to be strong. And she's a 4-star. So, what the heck does she do? When she uses her skill, she enters Nightsoul. When you use her burst, you give your active character an attack buff, which is very, very similar to Bennett. The attack buff is going to be larger or smaller depending on how much Nightsoul she has, and it's going to scale with her attack. Unlike Bennett, it's not base attack scaling, it's total attack scaling. What that means is that you're a bit less reliant on the specific weapon you're using, but a lot more reliant on the artifacts you're building on her. The attack buff at talent level 10 is capped at 690, which, for reference, let's take a look at Bennett's buff at talent level 10 without constellations. So with a 4-star weapon, so it's a little bit over 750 attack being provided by this, right, which is a little bit higher than what Iansan gives. Bennett also increases his flat attack buff at C1 by 20%, and at C5 with the talent levels, it goes up to 139% of his base attack, which with a 4-star weapon is about 1,000 attack, with a 5-star weapon is about 1,200. Iansan's attack buff at talent level 10 is capped at 690, and at talent level 13 is capped at 810. So the size of the flat attack buff is generally a bit smaller than Bennett at similar constellation levels. But there's a few things that are better and a few things that are worse. The main advantage that she has over Bennett is that she's a Nutland character and Cinder City's broken. Cinder City is just a very, very, very powerful artifact set, and so her having access to the 40% damage bonus from it is a big deal. When it comes to constellations that increase the size of her buff, she has C2 that also adds a 30% attack to the active character, and C6 that adds 25% damage bonus. If that's all you look at, it actually makes it so that the buff she provides tends to be bigger than the buff that Bennett provides. However, there's a caveat to that, which is she won't necessarily get the maximum attack buff. Her attack buff is dependent on how much Nightsoul she has. So her base limit of Nightsoul is 54. That Nightsoul goes down by 6 per second. Once it gets to 42, at 42 or higher, the attack buff is always the same, and it's 27% of her total attack. Now, this doesn't increase with talent levels. What increases with talent levels is the maximum, which means that if you want to cap the buff, you'll technically need more attack at talent level 13 than you would at talent level 10. So at talent level 10, the attack buff caps out at a little bit over 2,500. At talent level 13, it caps out at 3,000. As long as you have 2556 plus attack at C0 or 3000 plus at C5 plus, you will get the maximum attack buff so long as you're in this zone. Once you fall below this zone though, instead of being a static 27% attack, it becomes a buff that is proportional to the amount of Nightsoul that you have. At 42 Nightsoul, right, so at exactly the breakpoint, it's 21%. Instead of 27. I guess technically it'll be at 41. I don't know if the Nightsoul gets calculated with decimals. Anyways, whatever. But at 41 it's like 20 point something, which is a decent-ish drop off. But then the less you have of it, the less the attack buff is. And so once you get to like 20, the buff becomes 10% of her attack. Now, what that means is that, assuming you don't have a way to regain Nightsoul over time, it's an attack buff that starts out high and that goes down over time. However, you can gain Nightsoul points in a few ways. Mainly, she regains Nightsoul points over time, 1 per second, and if your active party member is an Atlan character, every 3 triggers of this Nightsoul point regeneration over time generates 4 instead of 1. So it's a little bit over 2 per second on Atlan characters instead of 1. But she loses 6 per second, which means that in practice, on non-Atlan characters, she actually loses 5 per second, and on Atlan characters, she loses 3.67 per second. However, she also can regain some of her Nightsoul based on how much your characters move. The more a character moves, the more Nightsoul they regain, and characters that move a lot can actually end up gaining more Nightsoul than they lose. Depending on which characters you end up using, some of them will be able to effectively stay in this zone for the whole duration. Some of them will start out in this zone, but will slowly go down over time and lose some of the attack buff. The amount that you regain from movement is apparently 0.67 Nightsoul points per unit of distance moved. Bit of a point of reference, we can talk about a few abilities that make you move and how much they make you move. A good way to find out how many units of distance you're moving is go to your quest log, path towards literally any quest, and press V so that it shows up the direction you're supposed to go with the distance. This number is in-game units, right? So you can see how much you're moving as long as you repress V, right? It's 12,748. If I press E, 43. That's about 5 units of distance we're moving with Clarine's E. With Xiao's E, right? 45. 38. That's about 7 units. I did a little bit of testing on a bunch of these, just to, like, try to get a feeling for how much they're generating. Xiao's jump is about 6 units of height, and then the plunge is another 6, so each plunge move makes him move about 12 units. Gumming's skill doesn't make him jump as high as most plungers, so it's closer to, like, 4 to 5 units, but his skill itself makes him go forward, and generally, when you're looking at optimal gumming teams, you try to go catch your Munchai by dashing towards it, which means that generally gumming moves about 8 to 9 units from the plunge, and then another 8 to 9 units from the skill plus the dash, so a little bit over 16 units per plunge. I did some very preliminary organization of, like, how much characters move. Basically, characters that don't really move lose about 5 per second, 3 point something if they're from that one. But characters that do move a decent amount end up with losing less per second. In practice, depending on what other characters you have outside of Iansan on your team, you might swap into your carry while you're at 54 Nightsoul, but you might also swap into your carry while you're at less than 54. If you're using supports that make you move, like Kazuha, for example, where his skill makes you jump up and down, or Xianyan, where her skill makes you jump up and down, you might end up swapping into your carry with full Nightsoul. But if you're using supports that are more stationary, like Chevaliers, for example, it's possible you swap into your carry with less Nightsoul. Apparently, also, movement during burst animation counts, which means that characters that move a lot in their burst animation, like Maoika, for example, can end up generating a lot of Nightsoul for Iansan. All in all, what this effectively means is that on characters that move a lot, you'll generally be able to get the full buff. But on characters that don't move a lot, it's effectively going to be a buff that falls off with time. It starts out at max, but it goes down with time. She also has a constellation that helps her with her Nightsoul generation. Her C4 makes it so that once per buff, basically, when you use any character other than Iansan's burst, you gain 2 stacks of a thing that effectively makes it so that you restore 4 additional Nightsoul points for your next 2 restorations. So effectively, this makes it so that when you use a character's burst, it additionally helps you restore 8 Nightsoul points. Also, if you end up restoring over the cap, she stores half of the amount you overcapped and restores that the next time she tries to restore. From what I've seen, her Nightsoul bar appears at the start of the skill animation, and by the time the skill animation is over, technically you also want to add this weird-ass swift storm flight after the skill, but like, we don't need to talk about that. It's effectively just, you can just consider it as part of the skill animation. But it effectively means that after the skill is over, you're not at full Nightsoul anymore, because the skill has an animation time. The burst restores 15 Nightsoul when you use it, so generally, if you do skill into burst, you will end up with full Nightsoul, and you'll probably overcap a little bit and be able to take some of this overflow. Now, because the cap doesn't change, it effectively means that if you have more attack than the amount you need to cap the passive, you will lose a lower portion of the buff when you're below the amount of attack that you need. This is most significant in Chevaliers teams because Chevaliers teams tend to have power resonance and Chevaliers' attack buff, often Chevaliers being on Noblesse as well, which gives a pretty massive attack buff to Iansan. And if you're playing characters that don't move too much in Chevaliers teams, like Raiden, or if you're playing Line against a boss where you're not intentionally going backwards and forwards, alternating between the two, or like sideways, right? If you're just using your skill without inputting a specific direction to help you move more, you won't move too much. On those teams, you generally still end up with a lot of attack on Iansan, making it so that even when you're below 42, you'll still spend a bit of time with the capped attack buff. So, for reference, Iansan's base attack is 257, which is, that's about average for a 4-star. And thank the Lord, Favonius Lance is a high base attack weapon, which is going to help her a lot because Fav is nice on her because you don't care too much about her personal damage, but you do care about the amount of attack you get, so having higher base attack is a pretty big deal. Her base attack generally will be 565. If you don't have Fav or you just don't need the energy, which is possible in some teams, you can end up using another weapon. The default one, I suppose, would be the new event weapon, the Torch, which gives you 40% attack on the passive. Anyways, let's take a look at like the upper limit of attack you'll be able to reach on these weapons. And if we're going to be doing that, we might as well look at the actual upper limit, which would be with Calamity Queller. From what I understand, unlike Bennett, she doesn't benefit from her own attack buff on her burst. So there's no flat attack past what we're getting from artifacts. But as you can see, the total amount of attack that you'll end up getting on Fav, about 3.7k in a build like this. On Torch, so it's about 4k. And then on Calamity Queller, right at 4.5k. At C0, at town level 10, her attack buff limit is 690, which means that you'll stay maxed until the size of the attack percent buff reaches 18%, which is going to happen at 37 Nightsoul on a build like this, 34 with Torch, 30 with Calamity. And once you reach this amount, once you get to 36, it's not a big drop off like it would be if you were exactly capped from 42 to 41. At C6, that won't be the case anymore, right? Because your buff limit is higher. So on Fav, you'd only be capped with this conversion rate above 42, which means that you'll never be capped under 42 effectively. On Torch, you get to 40, Calamity to 35, but that's not really that big of a deal. The point is, in these teams that get a lot of external attack buffs, you don't get punished as hard for not moving a lot. That being said, that doesn't mean you don't get punished at all. The main way in which you can get punished is through her C6. Her C6 gives you 25% damage only when you overflow Nightsoul point generation, which means if you don't move a lot and you don't overflow Nightsoul point generation, you won't trigger this. Now, generally, you'll still be able to trigger it about once, because even if you don't move a lot, from the C4, you can front load stack generation, plus from your using character bursts, that if that makes them move. But it is something to keep in mind, because it only lasts for 3 seconds. Unless you are constantly moving, you will not have a good uptime on this buff. Anyways, the base duration of her buff is 12 seconds. That is worse than Bennett. Now, you might be thinking, what the heck are you talking about? This says 12 as well. Well, it's not actually 12, because the way that Bennett's attack buff gets triggered is it's not an attack buff that constantly is active on your active character. It's a buff that checks the state of your character every second. If your character is inside the Bennett buff, or inside the Bennett burst, it will give them the buff. If not, it won't. And then that buff lasts for about 2 seconds, which means even if you swap out, the buff will stay for about 2 seconds, but it also means that if you get that last tick of checking for the buff while you're active on your character, it will last for an additional 2 seconds. This tends to be a big deal on characters like Arlecchino that often use Bennett's buff somewhat early into your setup in a team like this. Whether you're doing a Chevaleur's team or a Melt or Vape team, generally you don't swap directly from Bennett to Chevalier or to Arlecchino in these teams because you want to get Fishhole snapshotted. In Melt teams, because Bennett is generally part of your VV setup, or, well, you want to swap from Citlali to Arlecchino to get your TDDS. And if you're just looking at the amount of time you spend on field, alright, as you can see, the Bennett buff disappears before we're done with our uptime, which means that the 2 seconds longer duration actually matters a lot, right? That's an additional 2 seconds of buffing that a character like Iansan won't provide. However, Iansan's C6 also increases her buff duration by 3 seconds, effectively making it ever so slightly longer than Bennett's buff. The main thing to consider when it comes to figuring out which character is going to be better between Iansan and Bennett in a team generally isn't the buff duration. It's a mix of a few things. One, do you gain something from Cinder City? So for example, a character like Xiao doesn't gain anything from Iansan being on Cinder City because you can't trigger Electro Swirl with an Electro character because Animo can't be applied as an aura to enemies. So you won't be able to give Xiao an Animo damage buff from Cinder City. Alternatively, a character character like Mawika and Melt teams, you already get Cinder City from Citlali. And while you could swap Citlali to a different artifact set, the energy from Cinder City is a massive deal on Citlali, so it's going to be a lot harder to do. And then on top of that, even if you do that, it effectively means you're gaining that artifact set you swapped Citlali for. So for example, TOM, you're not gaining Cinder City. You already had Cinder City. The new thing that you have is just an additional 20% attack from TOM. So that's the first important factor. The second factor is, can you make the most of Iansan's attack buff? Are you moving enough to keep it high? Or are you doing most of your damage towards the start of your rotation, so it doesn't matter if it falls off later? Or are you able to get a lot of external attack buffs on Iansan, making it so that even when you're a little bit lower, you still have most of the attack buff? For example, a character like Chlorine will generally be able to get pretty solid uptime on the buffs, but a character like Raiden can end up struggling because she moves a lot less. Third factor is resonances. Resonances by themselves aren't a big deal, but when it comes time to comparing characters that do similar things, the one that gets the resonance generally tends to perform better. So, for example, going back to the Arlecchino team with Chevreuse, the current best Chevreuse Arlecchino team is this. You have power resonance, but it's not reliant on Bennett being here, which means that if you were to not have Bennett in the team, you would still have power resonance. With Iansan, you'll on top of that gain electro resonance, which will make your teams a little bit more comfortable to play because you'll have more energy generation. A similar thing can be said about electro characters in Chevreuse teams, because in order to keep good uptime on the debuff to resistances from Chevreuse, you need to re-trigger overload, and if your on-fielder is an electro character, because Chevreuse doesn't apply off-field pyro, these teams tend to perform better with off-field pyro characters, whether you're using characters like Toma just for a bit of defensive utility in that application, or characters that are more focused on damage like Xiangling or Mawika. In that last slot, you have a bit of flexibility, and you're kind of able to use whichever one. But again, here, you already have power resonance, and so Iansan should generally perform better. One very, very important thing to keep in mind is that, I haven't said it yet, but Iansan does have healing, but the amount of healing on this is not it. At a baseline, on a build that has a lot of external attack buffs, you'll generally get like upper limit about 4,000 attack on Iansan, but generally less than that. Generally, it's going to be between 3 to 3.5k. 60% of 3,000 is 1,800. 3.5k, 2,100. 4k, 2,400. This effect can activate once per 2.8 seconds, and the duration of it is 10 seconds after triggering a burst, but only during her skill. Only when she's restoring Nightsoul points. So generally you'll get 3, maybe 4 procs of this, but some of those will not be on your carry, so maybe 1 to 3 procs of this on your carry, which is not a lot. It's significant in the sense that when you don't specifically need healing for a team, a little bit of healing will help make your clears more comfortable. However, it is not nearly big enough to be able to enable Farina through healing. This amount of healing is significantly less than the amount of healing you get from Bennett. You'll generally be fine to like at least not die, as long as you're not playing like ass, but that's pretty much it. Also, in order for healing to matter for Chlorine, it needs to make it so that you need at least 1 less attack to use your skill while you're above 100 Bond of Life. By default, she takes 3 attacks because that enhanced skill happens above 100% Bond of Life, and she generates 35 per attack, which means that after 2 attacks, you've gotten 70. So you need to generate at least 30% of her total HP in order to have that be a breakpoint to get your E a little bit faster on her. But yeah, so that's that factor out of the way, right? Whether you need healing in your team or not can make Bennett much better. I've talked a bit about moving and being able to generate Nightsoul that way, but that's not the only effect of moving. Characters that move a lot can end up struggling staying in Bennett's buff, and Iansan's buff isn't limited to a specific area. It'll follow you around. So on characters that tend to struggle to stay in Bennett buff, Iansan not forcing you to stay inside of a circle is going to be a nice upside that she has. I haven't looked at comparisons of Iansan versus Bennett for every carry. So far from what I've seen, I'd say that she's generally a downgrade to Bennett at C0 in most teams because she can use Fav properly, unlike Bennett. Teams that care about energy generation gain a lot more from her. teams that could benefit from Electro Resonance and either already have Pyro Resonance, wouldn't get Pyro Resonance even with Bennett, or just don't benefit from it, can also end up liking Iansan even if she's providing less damage. Obviously, she doesn't have the C6 that can give infusion, so all the teams that rely on Bennett's C6 to function, like the Loop Plunge teams, for example, won't really be able to use her. But outside of that, I'd say she tends to be, honestly, fairly similar to Bennett, purely offensively. Bennett, I would say, is still much better overall because he's also providing healing, which, as it turns out, kind of matters a lot. But even defensively, it's not all upside for Bennett. The self-Pyro Aura makes it so that against certain enemies, Bennett allows them to trigger reactions on you, which can make you get one shot more easily. And if you get one shot, you can't heal, so the healing don't matter. I'm not a huge fan of characters having very relevant constellations. I think that's also one of the nicest things about Bennett, is that outside of his C1, which helps his quality of life a decent amount and just is good, his only good constellations are C5 and C6, and C5 isn't that big of a deal, and C6 is nice but situational. There's a lot of teams where it doesn't do anything. Honestly, the biggest portion of it in most teams isn't the Pyro Infusion, it's the 15 Pyro damage that it gives to characters like Arlecchino. Iansan gains, I'd say, much more from constellations. Most importantly, obviously the attack buff at C2 is pretty good. C4 helping you average more Nightsoul on a lot of characters, and C6 giving you that damage bonus, but maybe more importantly, that additional duration is a pretty big deal. I'm not a huge fan of that. I haven't talked about her personal damage very much. The numbers on it aren't too bad, but you will often end up playing her in teams that don't have too many buffs for her. You often won't get too many external buffs outside of attack buffs on her. And so while the numbers aren't that bad, because they often will happen when you're not buffed, they won't be that good either. I mostly talked about Pyro and Electro characters. Obviously, they're not the only ones that benefit from it, but like I said, Animal characters can't get that Cinder City buff from her, which is very unfortunate. Neither can Geo characters, and then attack scaling Geo characters are few and far between. Cryo characters can use her, but most of the time they tend to either not have the freedom to give a slot to an attack buffer. They aren't playing Bennett in them anyways, like in freeze teams, and a lot of freeze teams at least, or have 2 Pyro units because you want the attack buff and a melt enabler, and then losing out on Pyro Resonance can be a big deal. So while Iansan will be viable for some cryo carries, she generally won't have the best synergy. For Dendro carries, it'll be very nice for Kinich, but outside of Kinich, most Dendro carries don't care that much about attack. Most Hydro carries also don't care that much about attack. That's why I've mostly talked about the Pyro and Electro ones. That pretty much does it for the first impressions. I hope you guys are looking forward to the pre-releases. I'm really looking forward to these characters. It's nice in general to have good 4-stars, which obviously is a point in Iansan's favor. But then on top of that, I think that the idea of a buff that is better on characters that move a lot is just really cool. When it comes to Varesa, I think it's cool that we finally have a character with actual variation in their burst. It's a bit unfortunate that that variation is kind of worthless because the normal burst is kind of bad. So like I said, I hope they end up buffing it, but we'll have to see. As usual, for the pre-release videos, all of this information is subject to change. For the first impressions videos specifically, it's not just subject to change, it's going to change. The question is, are they going to buff it? Are they going to nerf it? Or are they just going to readjust it? But I don't think there's a single character that's made it from V1 of beta to live without a single change. So you can expect changes, and I will be covering the changes in the pre-release. So make sure you subscribe. Make sure you don't miss that video. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you learned a thing or two. I hope you're as excited for the next patch as I am. And I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye, YouTube.